Young billionaire returns home to find homeless gardener with his daughter. What he sees shocks him. Before we start the story, leave us a comment telling us where you are watching from. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to support us. Sebastian Hayes stepped through the grand double doors of his mansion, his polished leather shoes echoing against the cold marble floor. Silence swallowed the sound almost instantly, as if the house itself had grown accustomed to his absence. He stood still for a moment, inhaling deeply, but there was no familiar scent of home-cooked meals, no warm voice calling his name, just the sterile air of a house that had turned into a tomb, filled with everything except life. The weight of the past year pressed down on him, heavier than the designer coat draped over his arm. A year, 365 days since his world had unraveled. Since he had stood beside a mahogany coffin, staring at the lifeless face of the only woman who had ever seen him as something more than a business tycoon. A year since he had buried his wife Camilla, along with every part of himself that had once been human. Sebastian loosened his tie and tossed his keys onto the console table, the metallic clatter disrupting the suffocating stillness. He didn't even call out to see if anyone was home. There was no need, he already knew the answer. At 34, Sebastian had achieved what most men only dreamed of. His name was synonymous with success. His tech company had catapulted him into the ranks of the world's youngest billionaires. He owned 3 mansions, a fleet of luxury cars, a private jet, and a watch collection that cost more than some people would make in a lifetime. But none of it mattered. Not really. Not anymore. He walked past the grand staircase without glancing up, past the framed photographs that remained untouched on the walls. Camilla's radiant smile shone through the glass, frozen in time, unchanged despite the world moving on without her. He used to look at those pictures and feel warmth. Now they only served as reminders of everything he had lost. Sebastian reached his study and shut the door behind him, sealing himself inside the only space where he felt some semblance of control. Work. That was where he lived now. Not in the present, not in grief, not in memories. Work was predictable. Numbers didn't demand emotion. Spreadsheets didn't remind him of the smell of Camilla's perfume on his pillow. Contracts didn't whisper accusations in his ear about the way his 4-year-old daughter barely spoke to him anymore. Lena. His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk as guilt clawed at his chest. Lena, his daughter, his flesh and blood, his responsibility. Yet, he had failed her. She was only 4 years old, but in the past year, she had learned silence in a way no child ever should. Before Camilla's death, she had been full of giggles and endless chatter, a bright spark of energy trailing behind her mother like a shadow. Now she barely spoke, barely looked at him. The therapist had said it was her way of coping. Trauma, they called it. But Sebastian knew better. Lena was silent because of him, because he had become a ghost in his own home. He had buried himself in work, spent weeks at a time traveling, leaving his daughter in the care of nannies and housekeepers. He had convinced himself it was for the best, that drowning in work was better than drowning in grief. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had abandoned her. The last time he had seen her, really seen her, was 3 weeks ago. He had arrived home late from the office, the lights in the mansion dim except for the soft glow coming from Lena's room. He had peeked inside expecting to find her asleep, but instead she had been sitting by the window, hugging a worn teddy bear. She didn't turn when he entered. She didn't speak. "Hey, sweetheart," he had said, his voice foreign even to himself. "It's late. You should be asleep." She had nodded but didn't move. He had walked closer, hesitating before placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched so slightly that he almost missed it. That was the moment he realized he had become a stranger to his own daughter. A sharp knock at his study door pulled him back to the present. "Mr. Hayes?" Margaret, the housekeeper, called from the other side. "Would you like me to bring dinner to your office?" Sebastian exhaled, rubbing his temples. "No, I'm not hungry." Margaret hesitated, then sighed. He could almost hear her disapproval through the door, but she knew better than to press. She had been with the family for nearly 15 years, had watched him and Camilla build this life from the ground up. Now she watched it crumble, powerless to stop it. As soon as her footsteps faded down the hall, Sebastian stood and walked to the window, staring out at the garden below. Or rather, what was left of it. Camilla had loved that garden. She had spent hours tending to it, her hands covered in soil, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her laughter floating through the air as she coaxed life from the earth. She used to say that gardens were proof that beauty could grow even after destruction. But without her, the garden had withered. The once vibrant flower beds were now overrun with weeds, the hedges walled and unkempt, the fountains still and lifeless, just like everything else in this house. Sebastian swallowed hard and shut the curtains. He didn't need another reminder of what had been lost. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings, of phone calls, of avoiding the fact that his daughter had stopped waiting for him to come home. Another day of pretending that if he kept moving, kept working, then maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to face the hollow shell of the man he had become. But deep down, he knew the truth. No matter how fast he ran, grief was always one step behind, and no amount of money in the world could buy back what he had lost. The rain had just begun to fall in soft, steady drops when Sebastian Hayes stepped out of his mansion and into the damp morning air. The sky was heavy with clouds, casting a muted gray over the sprawling estate, but he barely noticed. His mind was already elsewhere. Shanghai, the impending business merger, the billions of dollars at stake. He was on his way to the airport, and yet something made him pause at the top of the steps. The garden, or rather, what was left of it. Camilla had loved this place. Once it had been vibrant, alive, a haven of color and fragrance, overflowing with roses, ivy-covered trellises, and carefully manicured flower beds that changed with the seasons. But now all of that was gone. Neglect had stolen its beauty like a slow, relentless thief. The once thriving plants stood strangled by weeds, their petals curled and lifeless. The grass, which had once been as soft as velvet underfoot, was now a tangle of browning blades littered with fallen leaves no one had bothered to clear away. A shadow passed over Sebastian's face. It had been a year since Camilla's accident, a year since he had stopped caring about anything that wasn't concrete: numbers, contracts, assets. Grief had taught him that the only things worth trusting were the things that didn't feel, didn't die, didn't leave. The garden was just another casualty of that lesson. His grip tightened around his briefcase. The world wouldn't stop for dead roses. He had a flight to catch. And then he saw her, a figure standing just outside the wrought iron gates, barely shielded from the rain. He frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he assessed the stranger. She was young, perhaps late 20s or early 30s, but her clothes were worn, practical, the kind you wore when you weren't afraid of getting your hands dirty. A canwood bag hung from her shoulder, and damp strands of brown hair clung to her face as she stood there, waiting. Sebastian turned to Frankie, his driver, who was already holding the car door open. "Who is that?" Frankie hesitated, following his employer's gaze. "No idea, sir. She's been standing there for about 20 minutes now." "Want me to call security?" Sebastian exhaled through his nose. Normally he would have. Normally he wouldn't entertain strangers at his gate, certainly not on the morning of a critical business trip. But there was something about the way she stood there, unmoving, composed, neither desperate nor timid. "Stay here." Frankie blinked in surprise but nodded. Sebastian strode down the stone pathway, his shoes crunching against the gravel. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and decay, remnants of a garden once nurtured by love. He ignored the sharp pang in his chest. The woman saw him coming, straightened her posture, and met his gaze with a quiet steadiness that was, quite frankly, unnerving. He didn't like being scrutinized like that. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice crisp and impersonal, the same tone he used when dismissing unwanted negotiations. The woman didn't flinch. She simply inclined her head, rain-damp hair sliding against her cheek. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I came about the garden." Sebastian frowned. "The garden?" "Yes." She nodded toward the untamed mess behind him. "I saw it yesterday while passing by. It needs care." Sebastian's mouth tightened. That wasn't news, but he didn't like the way she said it, as if the garden were something fragile, something that mattered. "We're not hiring," he said flatly, already turning away. "The garden disagrees." The words stopped him in his tracks. Slowly he turned back. "Excuse me?" Evelyn folded her arms, rain beating on the sleeves of her thin jacket. The roses are dying because they haven't been pruned. The irrigation system hasn't been checked in months. The soil's choking from neglect. If you let it go through another season like this, most of it will be beyond saving. Sebastian stared at her. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't selling herself. She was simply stating facts. He should have told her to leave. Instead, he found himself looking over his shoulder, really looking at the ruined garden that had once been Camilla's pride. The thought of it being beyond saving, of losing one more thing that had belonged to her, tightened something in his chest. When he turned back, Evelyn was watching him carefully. "You know how to fix it?" "Yes." He studied her again, searching for deception, for an angle, but found none. Just that quiet steadiness, the certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. He didn't have time for this. And yet, "I'm leaving for 2 weeks," he said abruptly. "If you're serious, you'll have that time to prove yourself." Something flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. He wasn't sure. "Understood," she said. "Margaret, the housekeeper, will give you access to what you need," he continued. "You will not enter the house, and you will not interact with my daughter." Evelyn's brow furrowed slightly at that, but she said nothing. Sebastian didn't know why he had added that last part. Maybe because the idea of a stranger coming anywhere near Lena unsettled him in ways he wasn't prepared to analyze. Still, the deal was made. He turned sharply on his heel and strode back to the Bentley, sliding into the back seat. Frankie gave him a curious glance in the rearview mirror as they pulled away. "Hiring a gardener just like that, sir?" Sebastian ignored him, opening his laptop. "To the office." But as the mansion faded into the distance, he found himself gripping his pen tighter than necessary. He had meant for this to be a simple decision, an impulsive way to rid himself of one more burden before his trip. But something about the encounter sat heavily on his chest. Perhaps it was the way Evelyn had spoken about the garden, as if it were something living, something worth saving. Or perhaps it was the way she had looked at him, not with deference, not with awe, but with the unsettling, quiet gaze of someone who saw beyond the surface. It was ridiculous, really. By the time he returned from Shanghai, this would be nothing more than a minor footnote in his life. Or so he thought. Because in 2 weeks, when he stepped through those doors again, everything would be different. Sebastian Hayes didn't believe in second chances. But what he didn't know was that while he spent the next 14 days in boardrooms and luxury hotels, something was happening back home. While he was discussing million-dollar deals, his daughter was finding her voice again. While he was making power moves, a garden was slowly coming back to life, its roots stretching, its flowers daring to bloom. And while he was fighting to keep his world exactly as it was, cold, structured, impenetrable, he had unknowingly opened a door he wouldn't be able to close. He had let in a force greater than grief. He had let in change. And soon it would be knocking on his heart, demanding to be let in. Evelyn Carter had expected many things when she accepted the temporary job at the Hayes estate. She expected long, quiet days tending to overgrown flower beds. She expected skeptical glances from the household staff. She expected to be treated as just another disposable worker in a house built on wealth and loss. What she had not expected was Lena. The first morning, Evelyn arrived just before sunrise, dressed in sturdy boots and a weathered work jacket. The housekeeper, Margaret, met her at the back entrance, her expression unreadable, but polite. "Mr. Hayes gave clear instructions," Margaret informed her, leading her to the storage shed where tools were kept. "You have full access to the garden and greenhouse, but under no circumstances are you to enter the house or interact with his daughter." Evelyn's fingers curled around the strap of her canvas bag. She had known coming in that this job wasn't going to be easy, but there was something about the way Margaret said his daughter that sent a flicker of unease through her. Still, she nodded. "Understood." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "There's coffee in the kitchen if you need a break, and lunch is served at noon for the staff." Evelyn gave a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you." Then she got to work. By mid-morning, Evelyn was deep in the rose garden, carefully pruning the suffocating vines that had all but choked the once vibrant flowers. She worked with a methodical rhythm, a silent conversation between her and the plants, her hands moving instinctively from years of experience. And then she felt it, a presence. Lifting her head, she turned toward the mansion and saw her. A small figure sat perched at a second-floor window, a thin face framed by long golden hair. Lena. She was still, barely moving, her little hands gripping the windowsill. But her eyes, large and impossibly blue, were fixed on Evelyn, a silent observer, a shadow of a child. Evelyn's heart clenched. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She simply held the little girl's gaze for a few seconds before turning back to her work. But she felt those small, solemn eyes watching her for the rest of the morning. Over the next few days, Lena's presence became a constant. She never came outside, never approached, but Evelyn could feel her watching. The household staff noticed too. "She doesn't speak much anymore," Sarah, the nanny, confided quietly over tea in the kitchen one afternoon. "Not since, well, you know." Evelyn nodded even though she didn't know in the way they did. But she understood loss. She understood what it did to children. Sarah sighed, glancing toward the ceiling as if she could see through it to where Lena sat in her quiet world. "We've tried everything. Therapists, special toys, new books, but nothing helps." Evelyn sipped her tea, thoughtful. The next morning she brought seeds. She wasn't expecting Lena to appear so early, but as Evelyn knelt beside the flower beds, carefully pressing the small seeds into the soil, she felt the eyes again. Lifting her head, she saw Lena standing not at the window, but at the back door. She was barefoot, her nightgown fluttering slightly in the breeze. And for the first time, Evelyn saw curiosity in those blue eyes. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wild animal, Evelyn lifted a small packet of seeds and held them up for Lena to see. "These are called zinnias," she said softly, not expecting a response. "They grow fast. You can see their first sprouts in just a few days." Lena didn't move. Evelyn set the packet down beside her and returned to her work. Minutes passed. Then a small, hesitant foot stepped forward. Then another. Until finally, Lena knelt beside her. Evelyn kept her hands steady, her breath even. She didn't want to startle the child. Didn't want to break the fragile moment. She pressed a small seed into the soil. "Just like this. You try." Lena's tiny fingers trembled slightly as she mimicked Evelyn's movements. Her blonde head bent in concentration. And then a whisper. So soft, Evelyn almost thought she imagined it. "Will they grow?" Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. She turned slowly, meeting those impossibly blue eyes. A year of silence. And now words. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stay calm. "Yes, they'll grow, but we have to take care of them." Lena's fingers curled into the soil. "Like Mommy did?" Evelyn's chest ached. She nodded. "Yes, just like your mom did." And for the first time, a small, fragile smile flickered across Lena's lips. From that day forward, Lena became Evelyn's silent shadow in the garden. At first, she wouldn't speak much, just the occasional question about flowers, about the insects that visited the petals, about the little fountain that had long stopped running. But then came the laughter. It started small, soft giggles when Evelyn made funny faces, quiet chuckles when they found a ladybug crawling on Lena's hand. And then, one golden afternoon, it came fully, freely, a laugh so full, so alive, that Sarah dropped the book she was carrying when she heard it. By the second week, Lena no longer sat at the window. She ran outside barefoot in the mornings, her tiny hands eager to help, her voice returning little by little. She named every flower bed. She spoke to the plants like they were old friends. She sang, not full songs, but little melodies, small hums of joy that drifted through the garden like sunlight. And inside the mansion, everything changed. Sarah began setting the dining table for 3 instead of just herself and Lena. Margaret no longer had to bring Lena's meals up to her room because she came down for them, eager to tell everyone about what she had done that day. The staff whispered to one another, "She's back. The little girl is coming back." And Evelyn, who had spent years drifting, carrying the weight of her own lost child in her heart, felt something inside her heal too. But then, the car arrived. Sebastian Hayes stepped out of the sleek Bentley, looking every bit the businessman he had been before he left. His posture cold, his expression unreadable. He had come home 3 days early, and as he stepped through the gates, his eyes landed on something he never expected. His daughter, his silent, grief-stricken daughter, was in the garden, laughing. Sebastian's breath caught in his throat. She was laughing, with a stranger, with Evelyn Carter. And in that moment, instead of relief, instead of gratitude, jealousy gripped him. Because how? How had this woman done in 2 weeks what he couldn't do in a year? His daughter, his child, had needed someone to bring her back to life, and it hadn't been him. His hands curled into fists, and just like that, he made the worst mistake of his life. Sebastian didn't realize it then. Didn't realize that sending Evelyn away would shatter the fragile world that had just begun to heal. Didn't realize that by trying to protect what was his, he would almost lose it forever. But soon he would, because a garden once revived does not die so easily, and neither does the love that had already taken root. Sebastian Hayes had never been a man prone to impulse. Every decision in his life had been calculated, measured, precise. That was how he had built an empire before he turned 30. That was how he had turned a struggling tech company into a billion-dollar enterprise. And that was how he had survived the past year, by shutting out everything that threatened to undo him. But today, standing on the stone path of his mansion, watching his daughter laugh for the first time in a year, he made the worst decision of his life. He didn't process the joy in Lena's voice. He didn't absorb the lightness in her steps as she twirled through the garden, her bare feet dancing over the grass, her golden hair glinting under the late afternoon sun. All he saw was Evelyn Carter, a stranger, a woman who had somehow stepped into his daughter's life and done the one thing he had failed to do. She had brought Lena back. And Sebastian, selfish, grieving, broken Sebastian, hated her for it. Hated the way Lena ran to her instead of to him. Hated the way Evelyn's smile was so easy, so natural, as if she belonged there. Hated that in just 2 weeks this woman had become everything he was supposed to be. His jaw clenched as he stepped forward, his presence heavy and looming, shattering the fragile happiness that had bloomed in his absence. Lena's laughter stopped. Evelyn turned, her green eyes meeting his with a quiet, knowing calm, as if she already knew what was coming. And then the words fell from his lips, cold, hard, irrevocable. "You're fired." For a moment there was silence. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the distant chirp of birds settling in for the night. And then, "No." Sebastian's breath caught as Lena spun toward him, her tiny hands clenched into fists, her blue eyes wide with panic. Real panic. "Daddy, no! You can't!" Sebastian stiffened. His daughter had never raised her voice at him before. Never fought him like this. He wasn't prepared for it. He wasn't prepared for any of this. "Lena, she can't leave." She ran to Evelyn, clutching onto her arm, pressing her face into her shirt as sobs racked her small body. Sebastian had never seen her cry like that, not when she had scraped to her knee as a toddler, not even at Camilla's funeral. Evelyn knelt, smoothing a hand over Lena's trembling back, whispering softly, so softly that Sebastian couldn't hear the words. But Lena could. She listened to Evelyn, she trusted Evelyn, and not him. The realization struck him like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. And instead of facing it, he doubled down. "I'm her father," he said, his voice sharp, his fist tightening at his sides. "I decide who stays and who goes." Evelyn lifted her gaze, calm but unwavering. "Then decide what's best for her." Sebastian's chest burned. He had decided. He had decided that no stranger should have this kind of power over his daughter. That no stranger should step into his world and make him feel like a failure. So why did he feel like the villain? A goodbye that should never have happened. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't beg to stay. She simply stood, brushed the soil from her hands, and nodded. "I understand," Lena screamed. "No, please, please don't go." Sebastian had never heard such desperation in his daughter's voice before. She clawed at Evelyn's sleeve, tears streaming down her cheeks, shaking her head over and over and over. Sebastian turned away. He couldn't look. He didn't want to see what he had done. "Lena," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's okay, little one." "No, it's not." Evelyn reached out, gently tucking a strand of Lena's hair behind her ear. "You're going to keep taking care of the flowers for me, right?" Lena hiccuped through her sobs. I don't know how," she whispered. Evelyn smiled softly. "Yes, you do." And then she slowly uncurled Lena's trembling fingers from her sleeve. Sebastian forced himself not to stop her, forced himself not to fix the mistake he had just made, because pride was a terrible, terrible thing. And tonight, it had cost him everything. The mansion falls silent again. The moment Evelyn walked through the garden gates, Lena fell silent. She didn't cry anymore. She didn't scream. She just stopped. Sebastian watched as Sarah, the nanny, wrapped a protective arm around her, whispering comforting words. But Lena didn't react, didn't move, didn't look at him. And in that moment, he saw her retreat, saw the walls she had spent 2 weeks slowly breaking down slam back into place, saw her heart shatter in a way that he wasn't sure he could ever fix. And God help him, he had done it. Not grief, not loss, not even the accident. Him. Sebastian turned away, striding toward the house, his chest tight, his pulse thundering in his ears. He would go to his office. He would drown himself in work. He would pretend, just for tonight, that he had done the right thing. And maybe, just maybe, if he told himself that enough times, he would believe it. Days passed, and the house, once filled with the sound of Lena's laughter, grew silent again. She didn't come down for breakfast. She didn't go outside. She didn't touch the flowers. Sarah told him she barely spoke. Margaret whispered to him that she cried at night. And when Sebastian, finally, found the courage to step into her room, he saw her sitting at the window again, just like before, staring at the garden, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Sebastian had built his life on logic, on control, on always knowing the right move. But for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. Can this be fixed? If you're still listening, tell me, what should Sebastian do? Can he fix this? Or is it too late? Lena deserves better. She deserves love. She deserves a father who doesn't let his pride destroy the only good thing in his life. If you believe Sebastian should fight for his daughter, if you believe he should right his terrible mistake, then like this video and let me know in the comments. Tell me, what should he do next? Because the next chapter of this story, it isn't written yet. And maybe, just maybe, there's still time to fix what's been broken. Sebastian Hayes had always believed that time healed all wounds, that the right amount of space, of distance, could smooth over any damage, any fracture. But as he stood outside his daughter's bedroom door, listening to the silence that had once again consumed her world, he realized something chilling. Time wasn't healing anything. It was making it worse. Lena was slipping away from him again, and this time it was his fault. It had been 4 days since he had sent Evelyn away. 4 days since Lena had stopped speaking again. At first, he told himself she was just upset, that children were resilient, that she would move on. But she didn't. She refused to come out of her room. She barely ate. She didn't touch the flowers in the garden, the same ones she had once named and nurtured with Evelyn at her side. She wouldn't even look at them. Sarah, her nanny, had tried to get through to her. Margaret had cooked her favorite meals. Nothing worked. And Sebastian, powerful, successful Sebastian, had no idea what to do. That night, when he finally pushed open the door to her room, he found her in the same place she had been since Evelyn left. Sitting at the window, staring into the garden, waiting. His throat tightened. "Lena," he said softly. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. It was as if he wasn't even there. He took a slow step closer. "Sweetheart, She turned her head then, just enough for him to see her face. The hurt in her eyes gutted him. "You made her leave," she whispered. Sebastian's chest ached. Lena hadn't spoken in days, and now the first words she said to him were filled with accusation. He forced himself to hold her gaze. "I was trying to protect you." Lena's tiny hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't need protecting." Her voice cracked. "I needed her." Sebastian inhaled sharply, but before he could say anything, before he could try to fix what he had broken, Lena turned back to the window, and she shut him out, just like that. The next morning, Sebastian did something he had never done before. He called Margaret into his office. "Find out everything you can about Evelyn Carter," he ordered. "Where she came from, where she went." Margaret hesitated. "Sir, Evelyn wasn't hired through the usual channels. She just appeared at the gate that morning." Sebastian frowned. He had never asked where Evelyn had come from, never cared. She had been nothing more than a fleeting problem in his meticulously structured world. But now she was everything. He leaned back in his chair, his hands tight around the arms of the seat. Ask the staff. Someone must have spoken to her. By noon, Margaret returned with what little information she had gathered. Evelyn Carter was an art teacher before she started taking on gardening jobs, Margaret reported. She lived in a small town 2 hours away, but something happened. Something that made her leave. Sebastian's pulse quickened. What? Margaret hesitated, her expression pained. Her son, sir. She lost her son. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. His grip on the chair tightened. Her son. Sebastian didn't breathe as Margaret continued. His name was Oliver. He was only 3 when he died, leukemia. The room spun. Sebastian pressed his fingers to his temple, trying to process what he was hearing. Evelyn, the woman he had cast out of his home, out of his daughter's life, had already lost a child. And she had looked at Lena, not as a replacement, not as a job, but as someone who understood. As someone who had walked through the same storm. That was why Lena had opened up to her. That was why Evelyn had been able to reach her when he couldn't. Because she understood loss. Because she understood Lena's pain in a way he never could. Sebastian swallowed, his chest burning with regret. Where is she now? Margaret hesitated. We don't know, sir. After she left the house that day, she didn't go back to her usual places. It's like she disappeared. Sebastian pushed to his feet, his jaw tight. Then I'll find her myself. Sebastian had never gone after someone before. Not like this. Not with desperation clenching at his ribs, pushing him forward. He had always been the one people chased after. He had been the one who decided who stayed and who left. But now he was the one searching. Now he was the one pleading for another chance. It took 2 days. 2 days of searching. 2 days of calling contacts, tracking small leads, following the trail of a woman who had never left many footprints. And then, finally, he found her. A small shelter on the west side of the city. He stepped inside, feeling out of place in his expensive suit, in his polished shoes that didn't belong in a place like this. A receptionist looked up. May I help you? Sebastian hesitated, then said, I'm looking for Evelyn Carter. The woman's gaze sharpened. Who are you? Who? Sebastian exhaled. Someone who made a mistake. When Evelyn walked into the common room, she didn't look surprised to see him. She crossed her arms. Mr. Hayes. Sebastian let out a slow breath. Evelyn. A pause, then. You found out, didn't you? She asked softly. Sebastian's throat tightened. About Oliver. Evelyn didn't speak, didn't confirm. She didn't have to. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, his voice rough. I sent you away because I was jealous. Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she stayed silent. I couldn't reach Lena, he admitted. I tried. I really tried, but I kept failing. And then you came in and suddenly she was laughing again, talking again. And I hated it. Evelyn swallowed. Sebastian, I need you to come back. His voice cracked, raw and unguarded. Not for me, for her. Silence. Evelyn studied him for a long time. And then finally she asked, will you let her see you? Sebastian blinked. What? Evelyn took a slow step closer. You keep thinking you need to fix her, she said softly. But maybe she doesn't need fixing. Maybe she just needs you. Not the businessman, not the father who hides behind meetings and flights in silence. Just you. Sebastian's chest ached. Come back, he said again. And I swear I'll try. I'll try to be the father she needs. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. And then she nodded. Sebastian Hayes isn't a perfect man. He's made mistakes. Terrible ones. But he's trying. For the first time, he's trying. Do you think he can change? Does Lena deserve a father who learns from his mistakes? Does Evelyn deserve to come back into their lives? Tell me in the comments. Because this story isn't over yet, not even close. And if you believe in second chances, let's make sure Sebastian doesn't waste his. Sebastian Hayes had spent years perfecting the art of control. He controlled his business, his time, his public image. He controlled every aspect of his life because the moment he let go, things fell apart. But nothing had prepared him for this. for the weight of the report sitting in front of him, for the truth about Evelyn Carter. His private investigator had delivered the file just 20 minutes ago, thick with documents, old newspaper clippings, and pages of handwritten notes. Sebastian sat in his dimly lit office, his hands clenched on the armrests of his chair, his chest tightening with every word he read. Evelyn Carter, not just a gardener, not just a woman who had helped his daughter smile again, but someone who had walked through a darkness even he couldn't comprehend. And suddenly, everything made sense. A life before the garden. She had once been a teacher, not just any teacher, an art teacher for children. Sebastian scanned the photos included in the report. In one, Evelyn stood beside a group of beaming kids, paint smudged on her cheek, a bright, open smile on her face. She looked different, lighter, as if the world hadn't yet taken something from her. There were dozens of testimonials. She was one of the best teachers we ever had. The kids adored her. She had a gift for making every child feel safe, feel seen. Sebastian swallowed hard, and then the report changed. The headlines darkened. Local community devastated by tragedy. Teacher loses son to leukemia. Grieving mother leaves behind her old life, disappears from town. Sebastian's fingers curled into fists. He forced himself to read. Her son's name was Oliver. He had been 3 years old when the diagnosis came. By the time he was 4, he was gone. Evelyn had buried her only child and lost herself with him. Sebastian let out a slow breath, his pulse roaring in his ears. He pictured Lena's tiny hands in Evelyn's, her quiet voice asking about the flowers, the way she had bloomed under Evelyn's care. She wasn't just a kind stranger. She understood. Lena had lost her mother, Evelyn had lost her child, and somehow in the wreckage of both their grief, they had found each other. Sebastian closed his eyes, and he had torn them apart. The house was quiet that night. Sebastian stepped into Lena's room, feeling like an intruder in his own home. She lay curled on her piano, hugging a small stuffed rabbit, her mother's rabbit. His gut twisted. "Lena," he said softly. She didn't move, didn't answer. Sebastian sat at the edge of the bed, hesitating. He wasn't good at this, at being a father. But if he had learned anything from the file in his hands, it was that Evelyn hadn't let her fear stop her from loving again. Maybe it was time he did the same. "Did you know Evelyn had a little boy?" he asked, a small movement. Lena's fingers twitched around the stuffed rabbit, but she still didn't look at him. "His name was Oliver," Sebastian continued, his voice raw. "He was about your age when he got sick. She loved him more than anything in the world." A long, heavy silence. Then, Lena turned her head, finally looking at him. Her blue eyes glimmered with something he wasn't prepared for. Hope. "She lost her little boy?" she whispered. Sebastian swallowed. "Yes." Lena pressed her lips together, thinking. Then, barely above a breath, "That's why she knew how to help me." Sebastian's heart shattered. She had known. She had known before he did. Lena curled deeper into the blankets, gripping the stuffed rabbit. "Will she come back?" she asked quietly. Sebastian hesitated. He had spent years making strategic decisions, choosing what was best in every situation. But this wasn't a business move. This was his daughter's heart on the line, and he had already made the wrong choice once. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to try." Lena turned fully toward him now, eyes wide, searching, and for the first time since Camilla's death, she asked him something she never had before. "Do you promise, Unc?" Sebastian's breath caught, and he realized this was it. This was the moment where he either proved himself worthy of being her father or lost the last piece of her heart. He reached forward, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I promise." Sebastian Hayes didn't beg. Not in business, not in life. But for her, for the woman who had saved his daughter, who had taught him more in 2 weeks than he had learned in a lifetime, he would. The next day, he searched for Evelyn Carter. Every lead was a dead end. No known address, no employer on record. She was a ghost, slipping through the cracks of the world, just like he had let her slip through his fingers. But then, a breakthrough, a shelter. A place for people who had nowhere else to go. Sebastian drove there himself, something he never did. The receptionist hesitated when she saw him, a billionaire in a charcoal gray suit, stepping into a place meant for the forgotten. "May I help you?" she asked, skeptical. "I'm looking for Evelyn Carter," he said, voice rough. The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the common area. "She's in there." Sebastian's pulse kicked up. He stepped forward, heart pounding as he saw her. Evelyn. She sat by a window, her brown hair tied up in a loose bun, her hands folded in her lap. She looked different here, smaller, like someone who had once had a home and had since convinced herself she didn't deserve one anymore. Sebastian took a slow breath, then stepped closer. "Evelyn?" She turned at the sound of his voice. For a long moment, she just stared. Then, "I told you not to fire me," she murmured. Sebastian let out a low, breathless laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah," he admitted. "You did." She arched a brow. "Let me guess. Lena's not doing well." He exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. "No, she's not." Evelyn sighed, looking away. Sebastian didn't let her. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "She's waiting for you." Evelyn's breath hitched, and there it was, the hesitation, the part of her that wanted to go back. Sebastian took a risk, a big one. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper. Evelyn frowned, taking it from his hand. She unfolded it and gasped. It was a drawing, crude, uneven, clearly made by Lena's tiny hands. 3 figures stood in a garden: Lena, Sebastian, and Evelyn. A family. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes. Sebastian's voice was thick when he finally spoke. "Come home, Evelyn." And this time, she said yes. Sebastian isn't perfect. He made a terrible mistake. But now he's doing something he's never done before. He's fixing it. Do you think Evelyn should trust him? Does Lena deserve to have her family whole again? Tell me in the comments, should she forgive him? Because sometimes second chances aren't given. They're earned. And Sebastian Hayes is about to earn his. Noah Lancaster had never been a man who apologized. Not in business, not in life. Apologies were for people who made mistakes. And Noah didn't make mistakes. At least that's what he used to believe. But as he stood outside a modest shelter on the outskirts of town, the cold wind biting at his skin, he realized something painful. He had made the worst mistake of his life, and now he had to fix it. It had been 5 days since he had fired Evelyn. 5 days since he had shattered his daughter's fragile happiness. At first, he thought Lena was just angry, that she would cry, scream, throw a tantrum, and then move on. But she hadn't. She had stopped speaking altogether, again. She barely ate. She wouldn't leave her room. She sat at the window staring at the garden, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. And it was his fault. Sarah, her nanny, had tried talking to her. Margaret had tried coaxing her out with her favorite meals. Nothing worked. And the worst part? She wouldn't even look at him. He had lost her. And Noah Lancaster, powerful, untouchable, unbreakable Noah Lancaster, felt fear for the first time in years. Because what if this time she didn't come back? He had spent the last 3 days trying to track Evelyn down. She had no known address, no phone number, no employer. It was as if she had vanished. But Noah had built an empire on finding what other people couldn't. And this time, he wasn't just searching for a missing woman. He was searching for a second chance. The building was smaller than he expected, run down but clean, a place for people who had nowhere else to go. Noah felt out of place as he stepped inside, his expensive suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the scuffed floors and mismatched furniture. A receptionist looked up, her expression wary. "Can I help you?" Noah exhaled. "I'm looking for Evelyn Carter." The woman frowned. "Who's asking?" Noah hesitated. Who was he to Evelyn? Not a friend, not even an employer anymore. Just a man who had wronged her. A man who made a mistake, he admitted. The receptionist studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the common area. "She's in there." Noah's heart pounded as he stepped forward. And then he saw her. Evelyn sat by the window, bathed in soft afternoon light, her brown hair tied in a loose bun. She was reading, or at least pretending to, because the moment she saw him, her fingers stilled on the page. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. And then, "I told you not to fire me," she murmured. Noah let out a quiet, breathless laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, he admitted. You did. She closed the book, setting it aside, her green eyes steady as she waited. Noah inhaled deeply, preparing himself for the hardest thing he had ever done. I was wrong, he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were true. I was wrong about you, about everything. Evelyn arched an eyebrow but didn't speak, so Noah kept going. I thought, he exhaled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I thought I was protecting Lena by keeping you away. I told myself I was doing the right thing, but all I did was hurt her. Evelyn's face softened, but she still didn't interrupt. So Noah swallowed hard and said the thing that terrified him the most. I don't know how to be a father to her. There, it was out, the raw, broken truth of it. Evelyn's eyes flickered with something, understanding. Lena doesn't need you to be perfect, she said quietly. She just needs you to be there. Noah let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I don't know how, his voice cracked. Every time I try, I just fail. Evelyn tilted her head, studying him in that way she always did, like she could see past the walls he had spent years building. Then she said something that stopped his heart. So you'd rather let her suffer alone? The words were a blade to his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, never. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. You already have, Noah. His breath hitched, because she was right. Lena had suffered. She had waited for him. And when he didn't come, when he shut himself away in work, in grief, she had found someone who would. And he had pushed that person away. He met Evelyn's gaze, desperation clawing at his throat. I need you to come back. Evelyn's lips parted slightly in surprise. But before she could respond, he said, for Lena. Not for him, not because he was sorry, but because his daughter needed her. Evelyn let out a slow, shaky breath. I have a condition, she said. Noah straightened. Anything. Evelyn's green eyes locked onto his. You have to spend at least 1 hour a day in the garden with Lena. No excuses, no business calls. Just you and her. Noah hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because it terrified him. He had spent the past year avoiding Lena's grief. What if he wasn't enough? What if she hated him? But then he thought about her tiny voice whispering, you made her leave. And he knew there was no other choice. He nodded. Deal. When Evelyn stepped through the mansion gates the next morning, Lena ran to her. Noah had never seen his daughter move so fast. She threw her arms around Evelyn, sobbing into her chest, her tiny fingers clutching at her as if she were afraid she would disappear again. Evelyn knelt, smoothing her hair. I'm back, little one, she whispered. Lena hiccuped. You promise? Evelyn kissed the top of her head. I promise. And Noah, watching from the steps, hands in his pockets, heart aching in his chest, knew he had done the right thing. But the real work was just beginning. Because now, he had to earn back his daughter's trust. That afternoon, Noah stepped into the garden for the first time in months. Lena was already there, kneeling beside a flower bed, Evelyn beside her. When she saw him, her tiny shoulders stiffened. But she didn't run. That was something. He hesitated, then knelt beside her. What are we doing? He asked. Lena glanced up, searching his face, and then, for the first time in weeks, she spoke to him, planting new seeds. Noah's throat tightened. Can I help? A pause, then Lena reached into her small bag, pulled out a packet of seeds, and held them out to him. His hands shook as he took them. And as he pressed the first seed into the soil, he realized something. This wasn't just about flowers. This was about starting over. This was about growing something new. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Noah isn't perfect. He's made terrible mistakes, but now he's trying. Do you think Lena will forgive him? Does Evelyn belong in their lives? Tell me in the comments. Should Noah get a second chance? Because sometimes redemption isn't given. It's earned. And Noah Lancaster is about to earn his. Noah Lancaster had spent his whole life running towards success, running from grief, running away from the one person who needed him the most. But today, for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't running. He was kneeling in the dirt beside his daughter, his hands covered in soil, his sleeves rolled up, planting something that would outlive them both. And for the first time, he felt like a father. At first, Lena didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. When he came into the garden that morning, she barely acknowledged him. She focused on her flowers, her little hands tending to the delicate sprouts with the careful touch of someone who had lost too much already. And Noah, the man who had built an empire with his own two hands, felt completely, utterly helpless. He cleared his throat. "What are we planting today?" Lena didn't look up. "Sunflowers." Her voice was small, clipped. "A wall." Noah hesitated. "Why sunflowers?" This time she did look at him, and when she did, it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "Because they follow the sun," she whispered, "even when it's dark." Noah swallowed the lump in his throat. He thought of her mother. How much Lena must have missed her. How much she had been searching, waiting for someone to guide her through the darkness. And all this time he had been too blind, too broken, to see that he was supposed to be her son. Noah wasn't perfect, not even close, but he was trying. And Evelyn? She noticed. She saw the way he struggled to connect, to unlearn the cold detachment that had protected him for years. One morning as he sat beside Lena, awkwardly attempting to help her sketch a flower in her notebook, Evelyn knelt beside him, smiling slightly. "Try holding the pencil lighter," she murmured. "You're gripping it like it's a contract you're about to sign." Noah shot her a look, but his heart softened when he saw Lena giggle at the remark. It was the first time she had laughed because of him, and he didn't want it to be the last. A small hand in his one evening, after a long day of working in the garden, Lena stood at the back steps, watching the sun set over the trees. Noah hesitated before joining her. He had never been good at moments like these, moments where there was nothing to fix, no numbers to calculate, no problems to solve, just being there. He sat down beside her, silent for a while. Then, "You used to sit with Mommy like this, didn't you?" he asked softly. Lena nodded, biting her lip. "We watched the sky together." Noah inhaled sharply. "I wish I had done that more." Lena turned her head, studying him. Then slowly, hesitantly, she reached for his hand. Noah's breath hitched. Her little fingers curled around his, warm and trusting. And just like that, she let him in. A few days later, as Noah was leaving his office for the night, he noticed a small envelope on his desk. His name was written on the front. The handwriting was wobbly, uneven, Lena's. With a deep breath, he opened it. Inside was a drawing. 3 figures stood in the garden: Noah, Lena, and Evelyn. A family. Noah traced the shaky lines with his fingertips, his throat tightening. And then, at the bottom, he saw the words she had written. "I love you, Daddy." His heart nearly stopped, because she had never written that before. Not since Camilla died. Not since he had shut himself away from her. Noah closed his eyes, pressing the drawing to his chest, feeling everything he had been too afraid to feel for so long. And in that moment he knew. He wasn't just a father in name anymore. He was finally becoming the father Lena deserved. There was a time when the Lancaster mansion felt like a tomb. Its vast high ceilings swallowed sound. Its hallways were thick with the weight of grief. And its walls, though grand, felt empty, devoid of warmth, of life. But now it was alive again. The soft echoes of laughter drifted down the hallways. The scent of fresh flowers, once wilted and forgotten, wove its way through open windows. And in the heart of it all, in a garden that had once been abandoned to time and sorrow, a father and daughter were finding their way back to each other. Lena's flower beds had bloomed beyond expectation. The sunflowers stretched tall and strong, their golden heads chasing the light no matter which way the wind blew. The roses, once suffocating under weeds, stood proud again, their petals soft, delicate, resilient. Noah knelt beside Lena as she carefully watered a row of violets. "See this one, Violet?" She pointed at a small sprout, barely peeking through the soil. Noah leaned in, frowning. "It looks tiny." Lena grinned. "It is, but it's growing." She patted the dirt gently, her fingers careful. "Evelyn says sometimes the smallest plants take the longest," she said thoughtfully. "They look weak at first, but if you take care of them, they get strong." Noah swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if she was talking about flowers anymore. Noah had spent so much time watching Lena, from afar, from behind the glass of his office windows, from the edges of the world she had built for herself in the garden. But now he knelt beside her. Now he dug his hands into the soil. Now when she laughed, it wasn't at a distance. It was with him. One afternoon, as they gathered freshly picked daisies, Lena looked up at him with a serious expression. "You don't work as much anymore," she observed. Noah hesitated, then nodded. "Not as much," he admitted. Lena studied him. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, glancing around the garden, at the place his wife had once loved, at the daughter he had almost lost, at Evelyn, who was trimming rose bushes, her presence a quiet, steady comfort. "Because this is more important," he finally said. Lena's eyes widened slightly. Then after a moment, she smiled, a smile that told him she had been waiting for those words for a long time. The mansion itself had transformed. Once dark, it was now filled with light. Windows that had remained shuttered for months were finally opened. The dining room, once set for just one, now held 3 plates every night, one for Lena, one for Noah, and one for Evelyn. Evelyn, she had become something he hadn't realized he needed. She wasn't just the gardener anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had brought his daughter back to life. She was something else entirely. And that terrified him. Noah wasn't a man who let people in, but Evelyn had never been the kind of person who asked for permission to belong somewhere. She just did. One evening, as they stood side by side in the greenhouse, he found himself watching her more than the plants. The way she pushed loose strands of hair behind her ear, the way she hummed under her breath while tending to the orchids, the way she spoke to the flowers as if they could hear her, as if everything deserved kindness. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said suddenly. Evelyn glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You've done more than enough here," he continued, clearing his throat. "The garden is beautiful again. Lena is happy again. You could leave if you wanted to." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Noah." He swallowed hard. He liked the way she said his name. Not Mr. Lancaster, not with cold formality, just Noah. "I could leave," she admitted, "but I don't want to." Something shifted inside him. A breath he didn't know he had been holding finally released. It was late one evening when Noah realized the truth. The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of crickets outside. Lena had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a book about wildflowers. Evelyn was draping a blanket over her when Noah spoke. "You changed everything." Evelyn stilled. Then slowly she straightened, turning to face him. He held her gaze, his chest tight. "If you hadn't shown up that day," he shook his head, "if I hadn't hired you, I don't know where we'd be." Evelyn's expression softened. "You would have figured it out, Noah." "No," his voice was raw. "I wouldn't have." She exhaled, studying him carefully. "You're a good father," she said softly. Noah let out a shaky breath. "I'm trying," he admitted. Evelyn smiled. That's all she ever needed. A pause. A heartbeat of silence thick with something neither of them wanted to name just yet. Then Evelyn turned to leave, but before she did, she looked over her shoulder. "Good night, Noah." He watched her disappear down the hall, and for the first time in years, his heart felt full again. Lena's drawings had changed. Before they had been filled with only 2 figures, herself and her mother. But now there were 3, Lena, Noah, and Evelyn, a family that wasn't perfect. A family that was still healing, but a family nonetheless. Noah Lancaster stood in the middle of the garden, his hands in his pockets, watching the golden light of the late afternoon stretch across the flowers that had once been dying under neglect. Everything had changed, not just the roses that now bloomed proudly, or the sunflowers that reached for the sky, but him. A year ago, he wouldn't have believed it. He had been a man buried in work, drowning in grief, convinced that as long as he kept moving forward, as long as he stayed busy, he could outrun the pain of losing Camilla. But pain wasn't something you could outrun. It followed you. It settled in your chest, heavy and unmoving, until you either let it break you or you faced it. And Noah had finally faced it, not in a boardroom, not in an office, but right here in this garden beside a daughter who had once looked at him like a stranger, and a woman who had taught them both how to grow again. "Daddy," Lena's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned just in time to catch her as she ran toward him, throwing her arms around his waist. He lifted her effortlessly, holding her close, his heart swelling at the feeling of her small arms wrapping around his neck. This, this was everything. This was... Did you see my tulips? She asked, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. Noah smiled. I did. They're beautiful. Lena beamed. Evelyn says they're growing so fast because I take such good care of them. He glanced up, finding Evelyn standing a few feet away, watching them with a gentle smile. Something warm settled in his chest. Something he wasn't afraid of anymore. Evelyn. She had been a stranger at his gate. Now she was part of their world. Not because she forced her way in, not because he had asked her to stay, but because she had belonged there all along. There was no defining moment, no grand declaration, just small, steady moments. The way she always knew when Lena needed comfort. The way she saw past Noah's walls, even before he was ready to lower them. The way she had never demanded anything from them, yet gave them everything. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to give something back. That evening, Noah did something he had been avoiding for over a year. He walked into his late wife's old art studio. The place had remained untouched, a silent tribute to the woman who had once filled their lives with color and warmth. But grief wasn't meant to be a prison. He ran his fingers along the dust-covered canvas, inhaled the faint scent of paint that still lingered. And then, he opened the windows. For the first time in a long time, he let the fresh air in. The past would always be a part of him. Camilla would always be a part of them. But life was still moving forward, and he was finally ready to move with it. A week later, Lena ran into his office, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Guess what? She exclaimed, holding up a sheet of paper. Noah took it from her hands and smiled. It was another drawing. A garden, a home, a father, a daughter, and Evelyn. Noah glanced at her. You like having her around, don't you? Lena nodded enthusiastically. She makes everything better. He swallowed, nodding slowly. Yes, she did. And for the first time, he let himself imagine what that might mean. Not just for Lena, not just for the garden, but for himself, for all of them. Noah Lancaster had once believed that wealth was about money, power, control. But in the end, he had learned that the greatest wealth was love. Love for his daughter. Love for the home he had once abandoned. And maybe, just maybe, love for the woman who had saved them both. This was the man he had become. Not perfect, not invincible, just a man who had finally learned how to love again. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready. Love doesn't come at a convenient time. And healing? Healing doesn't happen alone. Noah spent so long pushing people away, convinced he had to figure everything out by himself. But the truth is, we all need someone. We need the people who stand by us when we're lost. We need the ones who remind us that grief isn't the end of the story. So if you've ever felt like Noah, like you had to carry everything on your own, like you had to be strong instead of vulnerable, remember this. Real strength is letting people in. Real strength is choosing to grow even when it's hard. Real strength is knowing that it's never too late to start again. Do you think Noah made the right choice? Should he let go of his fear and take a chance on love again? If you believe in second chances, like this video, if you've ever learned a hard lesson in love, comment below and share your story. And if you want to hear more touching stories like this one, subscribe to the channel because every story teaches us something new about life, love, and the strength to keep going. Noah got a second chance. Maybe you will too. And maybe, just maybe, your next chapter is about to begin.